Every conspiracy story begins at the same intake desk. An ordinary uncertainty is treated like a completed explanation. I log the claim as written, then I separate it into elements that can be checked. The first rule is simple. A single causal chain cannot be built out of multiple independent unknowns without producing an analytical error. Most narratives compress gaps in time into a motive. They compress missing documents into intent. They compress unverifiable anecdotes into corroboration. That compression looks tidy, but it fails like a case file stitched from loose threads. When a timeline has a blank date, the story immediately fills it with a single intention. When a record is absent, the narrative swaps absence for proof. When witnesses disagree, the narrative selects one version and declares it consistent. I picture the evidence table as cluttered and physical. Missing timestamps are pinned together with string until unrelated items share the same tension. That is where the discrepancy starts to breed. A photograph with no metadata is connected to a memo that was never archived. A rumor attributed to people on the inside is paired with a testimony recorded years later, without the original transcript or recording. A translation is treated as settled when only a secondary rendering survives, with contested wording that changes the meaning of the key sentence. The important part is not whether any individual detail is false. The anomaly is structural. The narrative turns non-overlapping uncertainties into a single mechanism, then acts as if the mechanism explains the gaps rather than causing them. This first error sets the rest of the case in motion, because the story stops asking for corroboration and starts defending its own shape. At the next desk, I convert that shape back into testable fragments. What must exist for the chain to hold? What cannot be verified with the surviving record? And where the chronology breaks so cleanly that someone, somewhere, leaves no page behind. I pull the next file from the tray, marked astronomy. The claim is tidy in Apollo images. The stars vanish, so the sky must have been staged or the camera must have been compromised. But tidy claims don't survive contact with settings, and settings leave tracks. So we ask the first testable question: what does no stars actually mean in the record? The photographs are not casual snapshots. They were taken with specific exposure, filtration, and timing, optimized for the lunar scene. The eye in darkness adapts, but a sensor at a fixed exposure does not see in the same way. To the eye, stars can appear through long adaptation. To a camera exposure that prioritizes brightness control, the same stars can fall below the noise floor and simply not register. Now the second question tightens the trap. If blank sky were evidence of fakery, do we see inconsistencies when we account for exposure? In Apollo photography, mission artifacts and mission documentation repeatedly show that the cameras were adjusted to handle the moon's extreme contrast. A clear image of the target does not imply a perfectly complete census of dim points. It implies the exposure window selected for that moment. The clearest metaphor is a histogram laid over night sky, a chart that doesn't argue, it measures. If most of the signal is pulled toward the bright lunar subject, there is little dynamic range left for faint stars. Blank, then, becomes a result of exposure strategy, not an autograph of fabrication. Still, we need the final check. Are there counterexamples among mission material where stars are visible, or where the conditions predict their absence? Across lunar imagery, differences in framing and exposure correspond to whether stars would realistically appear in recorded data. The no stars argument collapses once the argument stops treating the eye's darkness as if it were the camera's measurement, and once multiple mission artifacts provide direct, situational counter-evidence. Next, we widen the aperture again because one visual anomaly is rarely the whole mechanism. And the method used to test this claim will be the method that tests the next. When we shift from photographic absence to historical absence, the pattern changes form but keeps the same vulnerability. Secondary narratives can outrun the primary trail by selectively quoting earlier statements, and then reinterpreting what those quotes were actually doing in context. Take a common cluster of JFK claims that hinge on a single, dramatic line attributed to an official witness or investigator. In many retellings, the line is presented like a smoking gun, impossible on the face of the timeline. The problem is that the line's meaning often depends on which version you read. The earliest transcripts, contemporaneous notes, and time-stamped interview records sometimes show the witness speaking in a different tense, answering a different question, or qualifying the statement in ways later summaries omit or compress. The most important discrepancy is not whether a sentence was ever spoken. It's the chain of custody for the sentence. Who recorded it? When? And under what prompt? If an early record is fragmented, missing a page, cutting off mid-answer, or carrying uncertain transcription, later writers can stitch the gap with a more coherent interpretation. That's where the inference hardens prematurely. What first looks like an impossibility can later become a documentation disagreement. The underlying remark may exist, but the later retelling edits alignment without admitting it edited alignment. Think of the timeline as overlapping translucent sheets. The earliest marks stay fixed on the glass. A later narrative sheet can slide forward, changing how the same underlying marks line up with a particular event until the story reads like proof. But when you check the alignment across sheets, you can measure the shift. The contradiction moves from physics to paperwork. From that couldn't have happened to we disagree about what was said, recorded, or preserved. That difference matters because it changes what counts as evidence. Documentary disagreement doesn't automatically exonerate. It calibrates the strength of the inference. And now we have to ask the next question. When these secondary retellings claim precision, where do their sources stop being traceable, and where do the gaps reopen? In the 9/11 conversation, one popular move is to treat a single smoking gun interpretation as if it were a disproof of every alternative. The claim will often hinge on an anomaly in instrument oddity, a missing beat in a timeline, a fragment of testimony, and then declare the physics impossible. But that's where the case file logic tightens. We have to separate what the record suggests from what the mechanism can actually support. Let us talk like investigators with constraints. Radar and sensor systems do not observe the world with perfect fidelity. They sample, they smooth, they report on schedules, and they inherit hardware limits and processing choices. When a conspiracy narrative maps an odd data point to one specific trajectory, it usually acts as though the recording process had zero uncertainty. The lock and key image fits, the key looks right on paper. Yet the lock-S tolerances in the real mechanism don't match. Now contrast that with how replication works across documents. Investigators and analysts compare multiple streams, primary logs, contemporaneous notes, and later technical interpretations, and they track the cadence of reporting. What was recorded immediately, what was appended later, and what changed as systems were corrected or re-explained. If a later summary claims precision that the underlying chain of custody can't support, the confidence doesn't transfer. It downgrades, because the strongest inference depends on traceable alignment, not on narrative convenience. Here's the critical discrepancy. Many arguments treat an anomaly as if it must falsify a competing model. But once the anomaly is mapped to instrument limitations, reporting cadence, and models documented at the time, the strongest conspiracy reading often falls from proven false to not established. Not because it's proven correct, because the evidentiary bridge is incomplete. So the next question becomes structural rather than emotional. When a retelling claims the lock fits, what exact tolerances are they assuming? And which primary records allow that assumption to be checked? 2. I remember the first time this kind of claim grabbed me physically. I stepped outside during a clear afternoon, and a long, thin streak sat above the roofs bright enough to catch my eye, sharp enough to make me squint. The story that followed an online post was simple. Look, that's proof of secret contracts. But the evidence trail wasn't simple at all. It was built by taking what an aircraft can legitimately do, changing routes, aligning with prevailing winds, climbing or descending through different atmospheric layers, leaving behind contrails or haze under the right optics, and then attaching an intent label that no primary record ever signed. That intent layer is where the mechanism turns into a marketing funnel. People start with plausible observations or documented flight activity, then recruit crowdsourced documents to supply motive. Those submissions often include screenshots, forum claims of leaked emails, partially copied PDFs, or incomplete procurement references with missing pages. Sometimes the records are real, but the chain of custody is not. We can't verify who generated the file, when it was collected, or whether it matches contemporaneous operational reporting. Here's the anomaly to watch for. When a narrative treats the atmosphere like a witness and the procurement story like a verdict, it conflates two different evidentiary standards. Aircraft behavior can be cross-checked with auditable flight logs and weather/air traffic reporting. Motive can't, if the motive case rests on crowd reconstruction or truncated summaries. The strongest inference can't survive basic scrutiny. The practical test is structural, not emotional. When you encounter a new chemtrails allegation tied to secret contracts, the key question is whether any procurement or operational evidence is primary, complete enough to audit, and traceable across dates. If the claim cannot produce complete filings, original logs, or a verifiable audit trail, only interpretations that reappear with each retelling, then the funnel keeps collecting mist, and the end of it stays empty. And that naturally raises the next case question. What happens to the quality of evidence when an allegation depends on documents that can't be independently reconstructed from stable record? I want to be precise about the transformation. I used to start from a blunt assumption that conspiracy theories are mostly deliberately fabricated lies. So the best move was either one pass debunking or dismissal. But the evidence doesn't behave that way. In these files, some claims fail because the record is missing, others because the interpretation is misread, others because alternative explanations fit the same observations, and some because the historical uncertainty was overstated. So now I treat each claim like a solvable case, traceable, checkable, and calibrated. If you spot a new allegation, don't react on vibes, ask for primary, complete, auditable records. Like and subscribe, and tell me which case file you want next.